Before we begin this incredible true story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss another amazing story like this one. Now, Thompson stepped into Miller's gun shop on a cold Tuesday morning. The 58-year-old woman wore a simple gray coat, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed the door closed behind her. But her eyes held a determination that made the shop owner, Robert Miller, look up from his paperwork. Margaret had never been inside a gun shop before. The smell of gun oil and metal filled her nostrils as she stood just inside the entrance. Taking in the rows of firearms displayed behind glass cases, her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to walk forward. The linoleum floor squeaked under her worn shoes as she approached the counter where Robert stood watching her with curious eyes. Robert was a man in his mid-60s, with kind eyes and gray hair. He had owned this shop for 35 years and had seen all kinds of customers walk through his door, but something about this woman made him pay attention. She didn't look like his usual customers. There was a sadness in her eyes that went deeper than anything he had seen in a long time. Margaret reached the counter and placed her worn leather purse down. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter as if she needed it to steady herself. Robert gave her a gentle smile and asked what he could help her with today. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but at first no words came out. She cleared her throat and tried again. She told him she needed to buy a gun. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady. Robert nodded slowly and asked her what she needed it for. It was a standard question he asked all his customers. Some people wanted protection for their homes. Others enjoyed hunting or target shooting. But Margaret's answer was different. She looked directly into his eyes, said she needed it to protect herself from someone who had been threatening her for months. Robert's expression changed. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the counter. He asked her if she had gone to the police. Margaret's eyes dropped to the counter, and she shook her head slowly. She explained that she had tried. She had filed 3 police reports in the past 6 months. Each time, the police had told her there wasn't much they could do unless her ex-husband actually did something. Restraining orders were just pieces of paper, they said. They couldn't protect her 24 hours a day. Margaret's voice cracked slightly as she spoke, but she kept going. Her ex-husband, David, had been released from prison 8 months ago. He had served 12 years for assault and robbery, but Margaret had hoped that time would change him. She had hoped he would move on and leave her alone. Instead, the threats had started immediately after his release. Phone calls in the middle of the night, messages left on her car windshield, flowers left on her doorstep with notes that made her blood run cold. Robert listened carefully, his face growing more serious with each word. He had heard stories like this before, and they always made his chest tighten with anger and sadness. He asked Margaret if she had any family or friends who could help her. She shook her head again and explained that her daughter lived 3 states away with her own family. Margaret didn't want to burden her with this problem. The shop was quiet except for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Robert studied Margaret's face and saw the exhaustion there. This was a woman who hadn't slept properly in months. This was a woman who jumped at every sound and checked over her shoulder constantly. This was a woman who had come to his shop not because she wanted a gun, but because she felt she had no other choice. Robert took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply showing Margaret the guns in his display cases, he asked her to sit down. He pointed to a small wooden chair near the counter and told her they needed to talk first. Margaret looked surprised, but did as he suggested. She lowered herself into the chair. Her purse clutched tightly in her lap. Robert walked around the counter and pulled up another chair. He sat down facing her, his hands folded in his lap. He told Margaret that he understood why she was there, and he respected her courage for taking steps to protect herself. But he also said that buying a gun was a serious decision, and he wanted to make sure she understood everything that came with it. He explained that owning a gun meant responsibility. It meant training and practice. It meant knowing when to use it and when not to. He told her about the legal consequences of using a firearm, even in self-defense. Margaret listened carefully, nodding at times. She told him she understood. But her voice suggested she was willing to accept any consequences if it meant saving her own life. Robert then asked her a question that caught her off guard. He asked if she had ever fired a gun before. Margaret shook her head and admitted she hadn't. She had grown up in a home where guns were never discussed, and she had married young to a man who later became violent. After the divorce, she had rebuilt her life slowly, working as a librarian and finding peace in quiet routines. Guns had never been part of her world, till fear forced them into it. Robert leaned back in his chair and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He told Margaret that he could sell her a gun right now if she passed the background check, which he was certain she would. But he said that selling her a gun without proper training would be like giving someone car keys without teaching them to drive. It would be dangerous for her and potentially dangerous for others. Margaret's shoulders slumped slightly. She asked him what he suggested she do. The fear in her voice was obvious now. She told him that just yesterday, David had left a note under her apartment door. The note said he knew what time she came home from work. He knew she was alone. He knew she was scared, and he was enjoying every minute of it. Robert felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. He told Margaret that he had a proposal for her. His shop had a small indoor shooting range in the back, and he taught gun safety and training classes twice a week. He offered to give her free lessons, starting immediately. He would teach her how to handle a firearm safely, how to aim properly, and most importantly, how to make the right decisions in dangerous situations. Margaret looked at him with wide eyes. She asked why he would do this for a stranger. Robert smiled sadly and told her she wasn't the first woman to walk into his shop with fear in her eyes. Many years ago, his younger sister had been in a similar situation. She had been stalked by an ex-boyfriend who refused to accept that their relationship was over. She had gone to the police, but they couldn't help her. She had asked Robert for a gun, and he had given her one without proper training. Robert's voice grew quiet as he continued the story. One night, his sister heard someone breaking into her apartment. In a panic, she grabbed the gun and fired wildly. The bullet went through her apartment wall and into the neighboring unit. Barely missing a college student who was studying at his desk, the intruder had been the building maintenance man who was responding to a water leak. He was not hurt, but the incident traumatized Robert's sister and could have ended tragically for an innocent person. After that night, Robert's sister moved away and never touched a gun again. But Robert had learned an important lesson. Guns could provide protection, but only when combined with proper training, clear thinking, and responsible ownership. He had made it his mission to ensure that anyone who bought a gun from his shop understood this completely. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as Robert finished his story. She thanked him quietly and accepted his offer. Robert stood up and extended his hand. She shook it firmly, feeling a small spark of hope for the first time in months. Robert told her they would start the very next day. Margaret arrived at the gun shop the next morning at 9 o'clock sharp. She had barely slept the night before, but it wasn't just fear keeping her awake this time. It was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was the feeling of taking control of her situation instead of just being a victim. Robert was waiting for her when she arrived. He greeted her with a warm smile. He led her to the back of the shop where the indoor shooting range was located. The range was small but well-maintained, with 4 shooting lanes and soundproof walls. The smell of gunpowder hung faintly in the air. Robert handed Margaret a pair of safety glasses and ear protection. He told her that safety was the most important rule in his shop. It came before everything else. For the first hour, they didn't touch a single gun. Instead, Robert taught Margaret about gun safety rules. He explained that every gun should always be treated as if it were loaded. He taught her to never point a gun at anything she didn't intend to shoot. He showed her how to keep her finger off the trigger until she was ready to fire. And he emphasized that she needed to be absolutely certain of her target and what was beyond it before pulling the trigger. Margaret absorbed every word like a sponge. She asked questions and took notes in a small notebook she had brought with her. Robert was impressed by her dedication and focus. He could see that she was taking this seriously, which made him more confident in his decision to help her. After the safety lesson, Robert brought out a small handgun. It was a simple 9mm pistol, nothing fancy, but reliable and easy to handle. He showed Margaret each part of the gun and explained how it worked. He demonstrated how to load it, how to check if it was loaded, and how to safely unload it. Margaret's hand shook the first time she held the gun. But Robert encouraged her gently. He told her that nervousness was normal and actually a good sign. It meant she respected the power of what she was holding. He explained that overconfidence was far more dangerous than fear. Margaret nodded and took a deep breath. She practiced loading and unloading the gun under Robert's watchful eye until her movements became smoother and more confident. When Robert felt she was ready, he set up a paper target at the end of the shooting lane. The target was a simple black circle on white paper, nothing that looked like a person. Robert believed that training should focus on accuracy and safety, not on imagining violence against others. He showed Margaret the proper stance, how to grip the gun with both hands, how to aim using the sights. Margaret's first shot was terrifying. Even with the ear protection, the sound startled her. The recoil surprised her, and her arms jerked upward. The bullet missed the target completely and hit the wall behind it. Margaret looked embarrassed, but Robert just smiled and told her that everyone's first shot was like that. He adjusted her stance slightly and reminded her to breathe steadily. Her second shot was better. It hit the edge of the target. Her third shot was even closer to the center. By her 10th shot, Margaret was starting to find a rhythm. The fear was still there, but it was being replaced by focus and determination. Robert watched her carefully, offering small corrections and constant encouragement. They practiced for 2 hours that first day. When they finished, Margaret's arms ached and her ears were ringing slightly despite the protection, but she felt different. She felt stronger. Robert told her she had done excellent work and that they would continue the next day. Margaret thanked him sincerely and asked how much she owed him for the lesson. Robert waved his hand and said they would worry about payment later. As Margaret left the shop that afternoon, she noticed something strange. For the first time in months, she walked to her car without constantly looking over her shoulder. The fear was still there, living in her chest like a heavy stone, but it felt slightly smaller now. She had spent the morning learning to protect herself, and that knowledge gave her a sense of power she had almost forgotten existed that night. When her phone rang at 2 a.m. and David's voice came through with another threat, Margaret didn't cry. She didn't shake uncontrollably like she usually did. Instead, she hung up the phone, wrote down the date and time of the call, and went back to bed. Sleep didn't come easily, but she felt different. She felt like she was fighting back. Margaret continued her training sessions with Robert for the next 3 weeks. She came to the shop every morning before work, arriving at 7 o'clock so she could practice for an hour before heading to the library. Robert opened the shop early just for her, and he never complained about the extra effort. He saw something in Margaret that reminded him of his sister, quiet strength that had been buried under years of fear and abuse. The training became more advanced as the days went by. Robert taught Margaret how to shoot from different positions, not just standing still. He showed her how to draw the gun quickly from a holster, how to reload under pressure, and how to make quick decisions about when shooting was necessary and when it wasn't. He created scenarios for her, using his words to paint pictures of dangerous situations, and asked her to talk through what she would do. Margaret surprised both Robert and herself with how quickly she learned. Her accuracy improved dramatically, and her confidence grew with each session. But Robert made sure to remind her constantly that owning a gun came with serious responsibilities. He told her stories about people who had made bad decisions in moments of panic, and how those decisions had ruined lives. He wanted Margaret to be prepared, but he also wanted her to be wise. During one training session, Robert asked Margaret a difficult question. He asked her if she truly believed she could pull the trigger if David broke into her home and threatened her life. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She lowered the gun and stared at the target in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but sad. She told Robert that she hoped she would never have to find out, but she believed that if her life was truly in danger, she would do what was necessary to survive. Robert nodded slowly. He told her that was the right answer, the honest answer. He explained that anyone who said they could definitely kill another person without hesitation either didn't understand the weight of that action or was lying to themselves. The truth was that taking a life, even in self-defense, would change a person forever. But so would dying because you were too afraid to protect yourself. As Margaret's training progressed, something else was happening too. The police had finally started taking her complaints more seriously. After her latest report about the threatening phone calls and messages, a young detective named Sarah Chen had been assigned to her case. Detective Chen had listened to Margaret's story with genuine concern and had promised to investigate David's activities. Margaret told Robert about Detective Chen during one of their training sessions. Robert was relieved to hear that Margaret finally had someone in law enforcement taking her situation seriously. He encouraged her to continue working with the detective and to document everything David did. He told her that a gun could protect her body, but evidence and police action could protect her life in a more permanent way. One afternoon, after Margaret had finished her training and left for work, Robert received an unexpected visitor. A tall man with cold eyes and a crooked smile walked into the shop. He browsed the guns in the display cases for several minutes before approaching the counter. Robert asked if he could help him with something, keeping his tone professional but cautious. The man smiled and said he was looking for a reliable handgun for home protection. Robert began asking him the standard questions about his experience with firearms and what he needed. But something felt wrong. The way the man's eyes kept darting around the shop, the way he seemed more interested in watching the door than looking at the guns, made Robert's instincts flare as they talked. The man casually mentioned that he had noticed a woman leaving the shop earlier. He said she looked familiar and asked if Robert knew her. Robert's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression neutral. He told the man that he didn't discuss his customers with anyone, as that was shop policy. The man's smile faded slightly, and his eyes grew harder. The man pressed further, describing Margaret's appearance in detail and mentioning that he thought she might have been his ex-wife. Robert felt his heart pounding but maintained his calm exterior. He told the man firmly that even if he did know the person he was describing, he would never share information about his customers. Privacy and discretion were fundamental to his business. The tension in the shop grew thick. The man stared at Robert for a long moment, and Robert stared right back. Finally, the man shrugged and said he must have been mistaken. He thanked Robert for his time and walked out of the shop without buying anything. Robert watched through the window as the man got into a dark blue sedan and drove away. Robert immediately wrote down the license plate number. As soon as the man was gone, Robert called Margaret at the library. When she answered, he described the man who had just been in his shop. Margaret's sharp intake of breath confirmed Robert's suspicions. It had been David. Somehow, David had followed her to the gun shop, or had found out she was training there. Robert told Margaret to call Detective Chen immediately and report this incident. He also gave her the license plate number he had written down. Margaret's voice shook as she thanked Robert. She promised to call the detective right away. After they hung up, Robert stood behind his counter, feeling a mixture of anger and worry. David wasn't just making threats anymore. He was actively hunting Margaret, trying to find out what she was doing and where she was going. The situation was escalating, and Robert knew that time was running out. Detective Sarah Chen took David's visit to the gun shop very seriously. She ran the license plate number that Robert had provided and confirmed that the car was registered to David Thompson. She immediately requested increased patrol near Margaret's apartment and workplace. She also filed for an emergency restraining order, though she warned Margaret that such orders were only as effective as the person's willingness to obey them. Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. David was becoming bolder, and his threats were turning into actions. She knew that something was going to happen soon. She could feel it in her bones. That evening, she sat in her small apartment with all the lights off, watching the street below through a gap in her curtains. Every car that drove by made her jump. Every sound in the hallway made her heart race. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the gun shop earlier than usual. Robert was already there, preparing for another day of business. When he saw her face, he knew immediately that she had reached a breaking point. Margaret told him quietly that she was ready to buy the gun. She had completed all the required training. She had passed her background check weeks ago, and she couldn't wait any longer. Robert understood. He brought out the 9mm pistol that Margaret had been training with, along with all the necessary paperwork. As they completed the purchase, Robert went over everything one final time. He made sure Margaret understood the laws about carrying a concealed weapon, about using deadly force in self-defense, and about storing the gun safely. Margaret listened carefully and signed all the documents with a steady hand. Before Margaret left the shop that morning, Robert did something unexpected. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small business card. On it was written a phone number in his handwriting. He told Margaret that this was his personal cell phone number. She could call him day or night if she needed help or just needed to talk. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she took the card. She thanked him for everything he had done for her. Robert watched Margaret leave the shop with the gun secured in her purse. He felt worried, but also proud. Margaret had transformed from a frightened woman into someone who had taken control of her situation. She had learned, practiced, and prepared herself. Whatever happened next, she would not be helpless. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed with the gun on her nightstand, the safety on, just as Robert had taught her. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The wind rattling her window. The neighbors walking down the hallway. The distant sound of traffic. She kept checking her phone, half expecting another threatening message from David. At 2:30 in the morning, Margaret heard something that made every muscle in her body tense. It was the sound of someone trying her apartment door handle, slowly, carefully, as if testing to see if it was locked. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She reached for her phone with one hand and the gun with the other. She dialed 911. Her fingers shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. The emergency operator answered. Margaret whispered that someone was trying to break into her apartment. She gave her address and stayed on the line as the operator tried to keep her calm. The sound at the door stopped for a moment, and Margaret hoped desperately that whoever it was had given up and left. But then she heard something much worse. The sound of metal scratching against metal. Someone was picking her lock. Margaret got out of bed as quietly as she could. She moved to the corner of her bedroom where she would have a clear view of the door, but also had cover behind her dresser. She held the gun in both hands, just as Robert had taught her, but she kept her finger off the trigger. Her whole body was shaking, and tears streamed down her face. The emergency operator was still talking to her, telling her that police were on their way and would be there in less than 3 minutes. But 3 minutes felt like an eternity. Margaret heard her apartment door slowly open. She heard footsteps in her living room. Heavy footsteps that she recognized immediately. It was David. He was in her apartment. He was calling her name softly, almost tenderly, in that voice that used to make her skin crawl. He was telling her he just wanted to talk. He was saying he missed her. He was lying, and they both knew it. Margaret's training took over despite her fear. She called out in a loud, clear voice that she had called the police and they were on their way. She told David to leave immediately or she would defend herself. There was a moment of silence, and then David laughed. It was a cold, cruel laugh that Margaret remembered from her worst days of their marriage. He told her she was bluffing. He told her she didn't have it in her to hurt anyone. David appeared in her bedroom doorway, and Margaret saw him clearly in the dim light from the street lamps outside. He looked exactly as she remembered, but older and harder. His eyes were filled with rage and something else, something dark that made Margaret's blood run cold. He took a step toward her, and Margaret raised the gun, pointing it directly at him. She told him to stop. Her voice shook, but her hands were steady. David stopped and stared at the gun. For the first time, Margaret saw uncertainty in his eyes. He told her to put the gun down, that she was being stupid. He took another step forward. Margaret's finger moved to the trigger, though she didn't pull it. She told him one more time to stop, to leave, that the police were coming, and then they heard it. The beautiful sound of police sirens in the distance, getting closer. David's face changed. The confidence drained away, replaced by panic. He looked at Margaret, looked at the gun, and made a calculation. He turned and ran back through the apartment. Margaret heard him fumbling with the front door, heard his footsteps pounding down the hallway. Margaret stayed exactly where she was, the gun still raised, until she heard police officers calling her name from her front door. Only then did she carefully engage the safety and set the gun down on her dresser. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. The emergency operator was still on the phone, telling her it was okay, that she was safe now. That help had arrived. 2 police officers entered her apartment cautiously, their own weapons drawn. When they saw Margaret sitting on the floor crying, one of them holstered his weapon and came to her side. He helped her to her feet and guided her to sit on her bed. The other officer quickly checked the rest of the apartment to make sure no one else was there. Margaret explained what had happened through her tears, describing how David had broken into her home and how she had held him at gunpoint until he ran away when he heard the sirens. Detective Sarah Chen arrived within 15 minutes. She had been monitoring Margaret's situation closely and had rushed over as soon as she heard the emergency call. She sat with Margaret and listened to the full story, taking careful notes. Margaret showed her the gun, explaining that she had purchased it legally just that morning and had completed extensive training. With Robert Miller at the gun shop, Detective Chen examined the apartment door and found clear evidence of forced entry. The lock had been expertly picked, and there were scratches on the metal that proved someone had broken in. She called for a crime scene unit to come and document everything. She also put out an alert for David's arrest, charging him with breaking and entering, violating a restraining order, and attempted assault as the sun began to rise over the city. Margaret sat in her apartment surrounded by police officers and evidence technicians. She felt exhausted but also strangely calm. She had faced her worst nightmare and had survived. She hadn't had to shoot David, which brought her enormous relief, but she had been prepared to defend herself if necessary. That preparation, that training, that gun had quite possibly saved her life. When the police finally left and Margaret was alone in her apartment, the first person she called was Robert. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. When Margaret told him what had happened, he was wide awake immediately. He asked if she was okay, if she was hurt, if she needed anything. Margaret told him she was fine. She thanked him again for everything he had done for her. Robert was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was emotional. He told Margaret that she had done everything right. She had gotten proper training. She had made good decisions under extreme pressure. She had protected herself without unnecessarily taking a life. He said he was proud of her, that his sister would have been proud of her too. David was arrested later that morning at his apartment. The police found evidence linking him to months of stalking and harassment. His parole officer was notified, and David was sent back to prison for violating the terms of his release. The prosecutor handling the case told Margaret that with all the evidence they had collected, including the attempted break-in and her months of documented complaints, David would likely spend many more years behind bars. 3 months later, Margaret walked into Robert's gun shop again. But this time, she wasn't shaking with fear. She was smiling. She brought with her a homemade apple pie and a card. Robert greeted her warmly and invited her to sit down. Margaret told him that she had something she wanted to share with him. She explained that after the incident with David. Several women at the library where she worked had approached her. They had heard about what happened through the news, and they had their own stories of fear and harassment. Margaret had been surprised to learn how many women felt unsafe and powerless in their own lives. She had an idea, and she wanted to know if Robert would be willing to help. Margaret proposed starting a women's self-defense and firearms training program at Robert's shop. She would help organize it and recruit women who needed the training. Robert would provide the instruction and facilities. The program would focus not just on shooting, but on overall safety awareness, legal rights, and building confidence. Margaret believed that what Robert had done for her could help many other women who felt trapped and afraid. Robert listened to Margaret's proposal with growing excitement. He had been thinking about something similar for years but had never taken the steps to make it happen. With Margaret's help and organizational skills, he knew they could create something meaningful. He agreed immediately, and they shook hands across the counter, both smiling. The program started small, with just 5 women in the first class. But word spread quickly. Within 6 months, Robert and Margaret were teaching classes twice a week to groups of 15 to 20 women. Some were victims of domestic violence. Others had been stalked or assaulted, Some just wanted to feel more confident walking alone at night. Each one had her own story, her own reasons for being there. Margaret became an instructor herself, certified and trained under Robert's guidance. She shared her story with the women who came through their program. Not to frighten them, but to show them that fear could be transformed into strength. She taught them that being prepared didn't mean being paranoid, and that taking control of their safety was an act of self-love, not violence. Robert often watched Margaret teaching and felt a sense of completion. Years ago, he had failed to properly prepare his sister, and that failure had haunted him. But now, through Margaret and this program, he was helping dozens of women become strong and prepared. He was turning his past regret into present purpose. One evening, after a particularly successful class, Robert and Margaret sat in the empty shop, sharing coffee. Margaret looked at Robert and said something that made him smile. She told him that when she had first walked into his shop all those months ago, she had been looking for a weapon. But what she had found instead was a teacher, a friend, and a new purpose in life. The gun had given her the means to protect herself, but Robert had given her something far more valuable: the knowledge, confidence, and strength to reclaim her life. Robert raised his coffee cup in a small toast. He told Margaret that she had taught him something too, that it was never too late to turn pain into purpose, and that the best way to heal old wounds was to prevent new ones. They sat together in comfortable silence. Two people who had been brought together by fear, but had created something beautiful from it. Years later, the program that Margaret and Robert started would help hundreds of women. Some would never need to use the skills they learned, and that was perfectly fine. Others would face dangerous situations and would be prepared to handle them. But every single woman who went through the program would leave stronger, more confident, and more aware of her own power. As for Margaret, she continued working at the library and teaching self-defense classes in the evenings. She reconnected with her daughter, who was incredibly proud of what her mother had accomplished. Margaret never forgot the fear she had felt or the night David broke into her apartment. But she also never forgot that she had found the strength to face that fear and come out the other side. The gun she had bought that day remained locked safely in her home, properly maintained and ready if ever needed. But more importantly, Margaret carried with her every day the knowledge that she was not a victim. She was a survivor, a teacher, and a woman who had walked into a gun shop looking for protection and had found a whole new life instead.